Assalamu alaikum everybody. Should we start? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You ready? For those of you who don't know me, and half of you here do, my name is Humera. I'm from an organization called An Nisa Society. An Nisa Society was set up in 1985, and we're a Brent-based organization. And our main project at the moment is a madrasa that we run in Wembley, which we've been running since 1986. And I have sort of a background in equalities, race and gender equalities, and various other social projects in the Muslim community with An Nisa Society. So what I draw on today comes really a lot from our experiences of building communities. And if I just give a very short recap, when we, being myself a second generation British Muslim, growing up without very much positive activities for Muslims, and certainly very little community in the sort of, when I was a teenager in the 70s in particular, is that, once I got involved with An Nisa, mine and our motivation was about community. How do we build community? A community that operates beyond our cultures, beyond our sort of racial groups, beyond our linguistic groups and madhabs even. And that has been our key aim of how to gather people of Muslim diversity, basically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give some reflections about how do we make ourselves more relevant as Muslims. And what I will start off with is quoting from the Quran, which in Surah Rum, verse 19 says, "He brings forth the living from the dead and the dead from the living, and He gives life to the earth after it's dead. And so will you be brought forth from the grave." And I wanted to start with that because before Ramadan, actually, I was feeling really miserable. I was following some of the things that were happening in Gaza and other places in the world, and I just felt really powerless, and I couldn't see that anything we could possibly do would make any difference. And then it so happened that Ramadan coincided with the birth of my first grandchild, who's over there. So I had this very sort of dual emotions happening between this really, I'm not a last days person really, but feeling, gosh, this is signs maybe of the last days of what's happening in the world, and between a new life being born, thinking, and remembering the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says, even if it's the last day, if you're going to plant a seed, then plant it. So I had to sort of push myself by, because my daughter's staying with me, to observe new life and to observe a baby and to observe every day the miracle of birth, and through the miracle of birth, the miracle of creation. And then by definition is, okay, what do we want for this child, this miracle from Allah? What world do we want for this next generation? And, and it sort of made me think, well, you have to keep going, you have to keep trying, and you have to, regardless if it feels that everything is stacked against you, you have to keep being innovative and trying to create the sort of change that we need. But what I would like to say before I go into my PowerPoint is to say that we say a lot as Muslims that we are an ummah, right? And I was just reading somewhere on Facebook, somebody saying about the Gaza situation, that it's proof that there is no ummah, right? Because the ummah hasn't had any effect on what's happening, and we are not powerful to create change. But the term ummah is an active term, and it doesn't automatically exist because we believe that it's an important concept in Islam. And it's something that we have to work for. And as in the saying of Sayyidina Ali, when he said, if one part of the body hurts, then the whole body hurts. we can repeat such sayings, but really not really understand what that then requires of us. What does it require of us to feel the pain of others, but not just feel it in a sort of international political sense, but feel it in our neighborhood, feel it in our families, feel it nearby. And how do we create this cycles of ummah? Because the overall ummah involves many, many ummahs. It involves many parts of the broader world of the Muslim community. And we have to ask ourselves, what is happening in our own back garden first? Because really, often people go on about this community and that community, they're powerful, they have a voice, people listen to them. But what I say to them about that is all those communities, even if we don't agree with them on certain things, they have worked very hard to have a voice. And have we actually worked hard enough as Muslims to have a voice? Do we just think that just because we can say, oh, we're the final religion and this, that and the other, we can make these sort of vacuous statements and think that therefore we have a voice? We don't. We have to work for the voice, we have to work hard basically for it. And really, there's no gain without pain in such things. And the truth is that every one of us has to do this work. It's not the responsibility of the few. And those of you who are regular participants in Rumi's cave, you will see, and I have seen over the years, a handful of people working really hard for the benefit of the many. And, and okay, that's fine at one level, but how can we make things easier for those people who are doing the work? And what I keep saying is that the relationship between those who are doing and those who are receiving is a transactional relationship. It's a two-way process. We seem to think as Muslims that because somebody is doing it, then we don't have to do it. We all have to do it. If we are not able to do the doing, then we shouldn't make the doing difficult. We should give ease to those people who do the doing. And I think that what I want to talk about today really is just give some thoughts and views about maybe things that we might think about if we want to create the kind of change. If you've been to my talks before, I like to start off with this, from Dr. Umar Abdullah, who opened a conference we did some years ago with this, and I really love it and I use it all the time. And he said, I like to begin as Muslims customary do with this beginning. In the name of God, the infinitely merciful, the actively merciful. It's particularly appropriate today because our concept of God, which is beyond gender, emphasizes his mercy, and the word mercy in Arabic is essentially a female quality. The Arabic word is derived from the most nurturing aspect of human physiology, the womb, the rahim. So we have mercy, rahma, the infinitely merciful Rahman, and the actively merciful Rahim. The whole concept is emphasized with the first part being the mercy of the cosmic God, the creator of the universe, and the second part, the Rahim, being the mercy of the personal God. I really find that really beautiful. And I think in a sense it also reflects an element of that's what's missing in our community, is that we have really not benefited from the feminine elements of the Rahim, the womb. And as I said earlier, given that I have just become a grandmother and seen birth and witnessed it, it really hits home to you that we are not really honoring this miraculous element of what Allah has given us as human beings. And also, what do we mean by ummah, right? An ummah, in a sense, is sort of siblings from the same mother. So there's a connection with the term ummah of leading by example, right? Becoming a mother rather than a father, actually. And it sort of focuses on the sort of nurturing elements of, and those of you who have been, and fathers can also understand the nurturing elements of mothering, in the sense that you know that there's so much more involved in looking after people, you know, your children or your family or your community. The nurturing elements of it requires a lot of actual sort of thinking about it, and relationships, and negotiating, and dealing with conflicts sometimes, and dealing with insecurity. There's so much that's involved in it. And the way that we tend to say ummah is as if we are, as Muslims, we are an ummah, therefore we should be together. But if we don't work at being together, how can we possibly understand what that's all about? And I just want to say a little bit about Sawm, about fasting, right? So, as you all know, and I'm sure those of you who've been coming regular here during Ramadan will be reminded of this constantly, is that often the idea of fasting is seen as training the horse kind of thing, training your inner horse of your elements within ourselves that sometimes become unruly. And so Ramadan becomes that trainer of the different parts of our psyche and our emotions and our behavior and our actions. And so therefore, much is written about once you remove yourself from these things, the noise of everyday life, that silence or that shift in energy, that difference of a relationship to yourself, brings the potential for something new. And I really want to focus on Ramadan as being a very transformative, actively transformative period. Because unless we approach it to be actively transformative, we can get lost in the fact that we want to break our fast, and where do we break our fast next, and about the food that we eat, and all of that kind of, we can get carried away with that. So this is something said by Sheikh Halima Krausen, is that fasting is not a mere physical exercise, although it benefits for our physical health cannot be denied. It is holistic. It is a holistic experience that affects different levels of our being. Sharing, solidarity, and cooperation are essential aspects of community life. Human beings are individuals, but they are not meant to exist alone. The very word insan in Arabic points to the fact that people are meant to be sociable, to complement each other in a wide variety of ways, contributing to each other's special skills and building up systems of mutual support and cultural wealth. The experience of fasting together and the communal breaking of the fast may strengthen the sense of belonging together in the family, in the community, and in humanity. But as you can see, there are many elements to it that if we don't keep it into our consciousness, we can easily forget. So I just put this diagram together to sort of show that really what we tend to focus on are the two vertical, isn't it, up and down?
Yes.
I never remember. Is the two vertical aspects of it, with worship and ibadah, ritual prayers, and then the sadaqah giving and the service that we see in Ramadan. That is what we sort of emphasize. I dare to say even overemphasize, okay? It's not that they're not important. I think they're all equally important. But people become a little bit mechanical in thinking, we've got to get the tarawih, we've got to get this, how much extra are we doing? But are they doing those things in a sense of the consciousness that I'm talking about? And the other aspects of Ramadan, the ones in red, is about your personal transformation and your relationship to community, because that is also elements of Ramadan. And one of my teachers always used to say that there's no part of even the 5 pillars which is not both an individual responsibility as well as a collective responsibility. So the two go closely together. We are individuals and we have to take responsibility for that, but we're also part of a collective which has its own particular responsibility, and we go in and out of the two of them. Both requires us to be responsible for it. And I like to sort of also use these verses of Surah Rum, where Allah says that He created us from dust, and He created our mates, and the ingredients of that relationship is to live in tranquility with them, and to have love and mercy in our hearts. These are all signs from Allah, and our variations and our languages and our colours, and the sleep that we take by night and day, and the quest that we take for livelihood, and the signs Allah gives in lightning as a way of both fear and hope for us. And I just want to put that in a sort of simplistic way, right? Maybe this is not the best kind of diagram, but I find that it sort of gives us a relationship with those verses that shows that if we put Allah in the center, what He's saying in those verses, that family and our relationships with people is important, our differences in our community and our health and our livelihood. And it's not by coincidence that our livelihood comes forth, because if we don't prioritize all these other things, which are our transformative things, if we don't see God in all that we do, and we don't see Allah in all that we do, and we don't have that conscientiousness, and we don't invest in healthy relationships with people amongst, because actually, you know, if you look at stats, the Muslim community has the most problematic families. We have high levels of mental health issues, we have high level of divorce increasingly, we have a whole heap of problems there. So it really then makes me question that when we are doing all this ibadah and all this effort that we make, how much do we take that into our everyday life? And I also like to give this another example. We have a friend who's not Muslim, and many years ago he really wanted to experience Jummah prayer. So my husband took him to Islamic Culture Center, and he said he really enjoyed the prayer. He was so organized and so, you know, together. But immediately the salah finished, there was chaos. And he said he couldn't understand that. How can there be these two elements to a prayer? Why is it that, in a sense, that we do not take that serenity that comes from salah into what we do the moment we step out of it? And these are really symbolic things that we have to look at to recognize for ourselves that there are issues that we have to address in the community. And I've been thinking a lot about leadership, because this is what a lot of people are talking about at the moment, particularly with Gaza. And people are saying that there's no leadership, there's no this, and there's no that, and everything. And I was thinking of, and I'm very interested in prophetic leadership. And if you really look at, these are just three very simple, experiences that the Prophet had of leadership. And immediately when he had revelation, he brought this message to a small group of intimate people who believed in him, right? And for a while, it was only in this small group of cohesive people who shared, who shared the prophetic vision, and they connected to Allah and the task the Prophet ﷺ had. So when something is cohesive with a small group of people, it works really dynamically, right? But the Prophet was living at that time in Mecca in a system which was very unequal and very unjust. So therefore the responsibility that he had was to work towards justice and to challenge the system. And so as he started to challenge the system, we know that that's when he had a lot of problems, because he was challenging a very dominant, powerful force in Mecca. And as you know, that the Prophet himself and his companions and everybody, they suffered a lot at the hands of the Quraysh, who obviously didn't want their power to be usurped. So they suffered a lot, they struggled a lot, but the early Muslims, they still fought. So therefore, then there's that next phase that the Prophet engaged in, which was about rising up against injustice. But it was hard for him, and the power of the Quraysh in Mecca at that time was so great that it was very difficult with all the torturing and everything that was happening for him to sort of be able to do exactly what he wanted to do. Then the chance came for him to go to Medina, which became a city of new opportunities, which had a different challenge. And we should know that the Prophet ﷺ wasn't sort of destined to be a tribal chief. If he hadn't become a prophet, he was just a regular participant of his tribe, right? And so therefore he wasn't trained as some of the men might have been into becoming a tribal chief. But he was a conscientious person, you know. He was a good person, and he wanted to change the system to be better. He wanted justice, so he was motivated by that. So by the time he got to Medina, he became a tribal chief, you can say. He became the leader in Medina, and he had to learn fast, right? He had to learn fast how to deal with the super complex situations that he finds himself in. And I would like to make some analogies with the times that we find ourselves in. I would say globally in the Muslim world, because most Muslim countries have become much more diverse and less monocultural. But certainly for us in London here, and Britain as a whole, and I think let's say London, is the most diverse Muslim population. It's a diverse population as a whole, but the Muslim population itself is super diverse. How do we know each other? We say we're an ummah, but do we know each other? I remember doing a workshop with some youngsters some while ago, and they were from different cultural backgrounds, and I asked the question, what do you know about each other? You know, and actually they didn't know anything about each other. You know, they couldn't tell anything about what country they came from or anything. Their historical background, their culture, they didn't know. And I'm sure if we sat and asked each other in the room here, do I know something about you? I would mostly not know very much about where you come from, you know, your culture in much detail, right? Unless I made the extra effort to do so. So therefore, I just wanted to highlight that we are living constantly in between these ways of being a leader. And we need to sort of draw, I think, much more on the prophetic example to know how did he deal with these things in those times. And so just very broadly speaking, there's usually what happens, the Mecca and Medina period is divided into two, right? We see that the Makkah is more about the building of the relationship to Allah, to Tawheed, to spiritual unity, and reconnecting the people, the Muslims there, to that spiritual message that the Prophet came with. And the Medina period was more about building social relations, creating social harmony, about law and other things. So these are things that, again, I want to draw this not just to keep it in the 7th century Arabia, but for us to see that we are living through those things now. Many of us are struggling with spirituality. Many Muslims may be born Muslims, but they never knew anything about Islam. There are new people coming to Islam who are starting from the beginning. So we are constantly in the period of Mecca where we are trying to reconnect to Allah and reconnect to the message, the core message, as much as we are seeking community and trying to do things right legally, to know how to behave towards each other. So these are sort of symbolic principles for us to say, how do we then create this in our life? And just in a diagrammatic form to show really what the Prophet ﷺ did in Medina was that the small circles around are the many different types of groups of people who were there, including the many different types of Muslims who were there, because there were Muslims coming who came to Islam at different points and had different ideas, and they were, so, as well as the people who were from other faiths. And so therefore the ummah that the Prophet created encompassed all of those. So therefore we should not be afraid of our differences and our diversity, or that there are people of other faiths and even no faiths, right? We should be able to negotiate and contribute to this way of being. So I'm not going to go on to that one. So I just want to then look at a few, take us to the times that we're living now. So just to paraphrase what I just said before, was to show in a very simplistic, short way that there's much that we can draw on but don't draw on enough from the example, from the prophetic example, to know how he went about doing things and how we can bring it into the times that we live now. So the reality is, in our times that we live now, is that we are living in Britain, in a world, in a system that operates in a particular way. And this diagram very simplistically describes the system. You have central government, you have local government, you have voluntary sector, and there are sort of groups within the local communities who reflect, young people, different cultural groups, racial groups, elderly, and there are also faith communities. What I want to show very briefly is, and the point I want to make is that when people have said, why is it that Muslims in Britain don't have a voice, for example, with the problems that are happening globally or even locally, we have to ask ourselves, why don't we have a voice? Why is it that when we are transforming ourselves during Ramadan, strengthening ourselves, trying to be more purposeful, we can't do that so well when we're outside of Ramadan, outside of a salah? We find it difficult to then negotiate that. We have to ask ourselves some very deep and meaningful questions about that. So this is the system that we live in, and we have to understand that how this actually works. Because when we feel that when we go to the hospital, that our women maybe sometimes who wear hijab get treated this way, or another person in the school gets treated that way, or somebody else in the legal system gets treated that way, and people are going, kind of see it all the time on Facebook, moaning and groaning, Islamophobia, this, that and the other. Yes, there is elements of Islamophobia, but what are we doing to have the voice that is taken seriously in the system? We have to ask ourselves that question. Are we just ready just to moan and groan, but we are not actually participating in order in society as a whole and for our voices to be understood in a meaningful way? And how that system fails for us as Muslims is because we don't have enough investment in pastoral projects like this, and we have also social exclusion. And Muslims ourselves, we are not investing in our social welfare, in our local communities, and to work to eliminate the sort of weaknesses that we have. Let's just say young people. When I walk around in Brent, I see in London, the Muslim population is about 1 in 8 now. And the younger population, we're overrepresented in the younger population under 25. But what is there for them? Many of you are young, or not younger than me anyway, and you must have gone through things where you have nowhere to go and nobody understands you. And how do you work out at being your teenage angst? How do you go into a protective environment where people understand you? Where are those places, right? There isn't any investment in that, right? And if we don't invest in it, you walk around the streets, I see, particularly boys, although girls are increasingly getting into gangs, you see boys going, you can feel their restlessness. You can feel that they're walking around with a chip on their shoulder. You can feel they don't know what to do with themselves. And they end up in shisha bars once they're able to do that. That's the only place that young Muslims can go, which is a sort of social gathering. Okay? I might, if there's time. Yeah. So I just want to really quickly explain how this system works. And I use the example of age concern. I think it's called something else now. I did this one. Yeah, okay. And how that works is that every area has a shop front where they provide frontline services, right? And some of it is funded by the public sector, quite often it is, and maybe by other donations. What these organizations do is they collect stats because they're experts in their field. From those stats they make reports. So they might say, last winter, fuel poverty went up because the price of oil went up and the elderly are suffering more than others, and the government has to give them some fuel subsidy. They might, for example, ask for something like that. Because they have the stats, they've done the work, they've got the research, so they produce a report and then they lobby. They lobby to the various places that you lobby, getting back to central government, and to lobby for change. Government doesn't always listen, but if you keep lobbying and trying, you can push them into changing, right? We don't do that effectively. I've been involved in some of the stuff that the government do with Muslims, and it's a disaster actually, and I stopped doing it because it's really disastrous. So I'm just going to rush through, think how much time, there's not that much time left. So what is Islam about then? Why do we still hold on to this faith, right, so strongly? So Islam is really, it's challenging. We get challenged by it. It reconnects us not only to Allah, it reconnects us to other people. We're empowered by it. And it's an integrating force, right? Once we've understood it, we try to integrate the wisdoms and our things that we learn from it into our lives, right? And I'm not going to read these because of the time is not very, we haven't got much time, is that, you know, I just want to go through a few things that we could draw on from our traditions, which shows that some of the techniques the Prophet ﷺ himself used. So, for example, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which was seen at the time very negatively by many of the Sahaba, but the Prophet ﷺ knew something more, that in the short term there were compromises that they had to make in order for a bigger victory to come later, right? So therefore, when you have a strategic vision, when you're thinking, and the thing that the Prophet ﷺ did when he became the leader and he had to learn fast, he had a lot of insight, he learned fast on the job, he could see ahead, he could predict, right? And he understood how to manage the sort of, although he struggled with this one because he had to take the advice of Salama of what to do there, but he was a very fast learner. So therefore there was this compromise that was made, which was necessary at that time for something that might be better in the future. And these are questions that we need to ask ourselves today, is that in the short term, while we are powerless, because they were still reasonably powerless, though growing in power, they were still powerless, at what point do we compromise so that there is something greater to be achieved in the longer term, all right? And also, for this, I did these verses of when Sayyidina Ibrahim salam is looking for Allah, when he's looking at the stars and the moon and everything. And sometimes we find ourselves in that situation because actually, as Muslims, we've had a very fractured upbringing with our faith. We don't really know the Quran. We don't know what the Quran means, myself included, because I read it mainly in English because I want to understand it, right? So many of us are taught it in Arabic just to know by recitation, but we don't know its meaning. We don't know how it was revealed. We don't know the deeper meanings behind it quite often. And so sometimes we find ourselves in a situation that we, you know, I don't know how many people over the years, myself included, that you don't know really, you don't understand what people are telling you about Islam, but then something instinctively tells you it's not this and it's not that, it's not the other thing. You just know instinctively that something is not right until you find the thing that really connects to Allah in a more comprehensive and fuller way. That we are living in a time where we are wandering in the wilderness looking for that greater relationship with Allah. And, you know, and sometimes, you know, we have to trust ourselves. You know, the famous saying when the Prophet was asked, you know, what is righteousness? And he said, consult your heart. Righteousness is that about which the soul feels tranquil and the heart feels tranquil, and wrongdoing is that which wavers in the soul and moves it to and from the breast, even though people again and again have given you their legal opinions in its favor, right? So because we are, you know, again, like you're saying, often left alone, we have to trust something deeper within ourselves. And what is also important is that it's I know from my own experience of involved in Muslim activities, is there's a tendency to be very top down and to want to speak to the big people and to be very lofty. And the Prophet ﷺ himself was chastised by Allah in the Quran when he turned away to speak to a more prestigious person in the community because he wanted to persuade him when there was a blind man, you know, wanting his attention. So therefore, you know, this is something which we can symbolically say to ourselves. Are we so obsessed with pursuing legitimacy from people in power rather than maintaining a relationship with people on the ground? And negotiating the peace. And just a little bit of a section from the Constitution of Medina, where what is interesting about it is that the Prophet ﷺ didn't actually change anything when he when he put together the constitution in Medina, he didn't tell any of the tribes, look, this is my system, you follow me, this is the way, whatever you did before wasn't the right way, and you have to change. He didn't say that. He said, Bunny, this people, you had that well, you had this people, and you did this. So all the people at that point, because you will find when, like say for example, many converts I've spoken to, what happens, they then suddenly get overwhelmed by Muslims who tell them, you've got to do this, 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 rather than starting off and consolidating where they are at that moment. They've come to Islam with a lot of effort, they're good people, let them go from where they're at to grow step by step, to go and grow within the faith, rather than give them a lot of rules and regulations, this, that, and the other. The Prophet ﷺ knew that these people were people who still needed a lot of help and support. He didn't change them. He didn't ask them to change anything at that point, but his teachings and the things that he did created the change, that people willingly created the change. And you know, we just have to remember that Allah doesn't wish for us hardship. And sometimes we make our faith very hard, right? And you know, He desires ease for us, and we have to remind ourselves that sometimes that, you know, if there's two ways to do something, the Prophet advised to take the easier way, right? So we have to remember that being a martyr on some things is not what Allah asks us. He asks us to be conscientious. He asks us to transform ourselves. He asks us to be responsible. So we go from, I've got lots of, I hope it's all making sense because there's lots of stuff that needs much more elaboration. So therefore really what is Islam is, it's at a basic level, it's rebuilding the human potential, which very easily gets lost in our everyday lives. And Ramadan, more than any other time of year, is where we remind ourselves about that human potential. We go back into the elements of what we are as human beings and what Allah asks of us, which is, and we should hope that beyond the fast and beyond the end of Ramadan and beyond our salah, that we go in the months ahead, we go and we make a difference in the world, a difference in our lives and a difference in the world. And a reminder that actually what is the Quran. Often when people talk about Islam, they put Allah in the middle. And what happens is it all becomes about ibadah, right? You pray, you do this, you do that. But if you put yourself in the middle, because the Quran is talking to us, it's talking to us to personally, it's our personal relationship to Allah. And of course, we connect to Allah primarily, that's what we do, that's through the Quran we connect to Him. But what does the Quran tell us? It connects us to creation, to other human beings, to other living beings, and it connects us to ourselves. So when we read the Quran, we have to constantly, if I was to put where I am on all of those things, maybe not great on many of those things, and I see that chart and I think, I have to work on this bit. Like I'm not very good at going into creation, I'm not very good at green spaces, I'm a bit of a city person. And really, when you go into creation, you see Allah there. So, you know, so therefore this is basically what the Quran is all about. And I just really want to sort of end with this, because this is a book that I've been very affected about recently. And what I'm trying to talk about really is about what do we want for the future? You know, as Muslims, we are so many in number, but so powerless. So we really need to think, how can we change that? And in this book, it's a really nice book, which gives a very easily accessible look at the Prophet and his leadership. And I printed it, but I won't read it. But he has a section in the back, which, if you have the book, gives really good explanation of these different things, like the character, the qualities of the Prophet, his strategic vision, strategic communication, consensus building, learning from others, establishing rapport, choosing the right way of dealing with any opposition, managing people. So we have the best of examples from our Prophet, and if you read that book, and there's many other books as well, that you know, are we actually drawing the right things from the prophetic example for us in this time of where we feel beleaguered and disempowered, and we have to, I'm afraid, I think We don't have a choice. If we want to survive as people, we don't have a choice but to raise our game. We have to do better than what we've been doing so far. So I just want to end with the verse I started with, that Allah is the one who brings the living from the dead, and He gives life to the earth after its death. So therefore, nothing is unsolvable, unsolvable and unsavable. Everything, you know, those of you, and I'm not very good at keeping plants alive, I've killed many, but if you look after them, they come alive. This is Allah's creation. We can bring a dead plant alive again, right? We can bring ourselves alive again, even though we feel emotionally dead, powerless. So, you know, we have to think about it. And just to say, and leave with this saying, Allah, bring our hearts together, reconcile between us, guide us to the ways of peace, and deliver us from the darkness into light, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. I can have one or two questions if we have time. We have 2 minutes, I think, maybe. Any questions? Thank you.